Hello, first and second graders. Welcome to Sunday School. Today, you are going to need your Friends pack out of your folder and from your Discovery pack, the page that says Wilderness. So go ahead and get those out. Okay. How would you feel if a friend told your secret that you had told them? Would it make you feel sad or hurt that they had shared something that you told them in private? Would it make you feel like getting even? Sometimes we feel that way. How would you feel if kids made fun of you for not going along with them with something they wanted to do? Would you feel like you were angry at them? Would you feel hurt or scared, or maybe you wouldn't trust them? Or sometimes you'd feel like getting even. We're going to talk about those things today because when people we know or trust hurt us, it makes us feel really bad. Sometimes we feel like crying. Sometimes we feel like we can't trust anyone again. And sometimes we feel like getting even. You may have felt like this before, but maybe you did what was right instead of getting even. How hard was that? We're going to talk about those things today in Sunday School. We all feel from time to time like we want to get even with someone, and it can be hard not to. In today's Bible story, we're going to see the problems between David and King Saul getting really bad. Let's listen, and we're going to hear how David felt about Saul and what he did about King Saul when he had the chance to get even. So we are going to read a little play for you today, and I have Miss Nancy and Miss Renee coming in to join us. See, you can see them as they walked in. Oh, Miss Renee, step this way so they can see you. There they are. Okay, I'm going to hold a picture up for you, but they're going to be reading with me, and we're going to be playing the part of a reporter. That's Miss Renee. I'll be David, and Miss Nancy is going to be Abishai, okay? That's hard to say. I'm going to probably say it a few different ways, but I'll do my best. So listen as we read this little play to you. Reporter.
David, I'm a reporter. I hear you were doing some sneaking around last night.
Yes, but for a good reason. One of my soldiers, Abishai, came with me to King Saul's camp.
King Saul had been chasing David, trying to kill him. So David and his men had been hiding out in the wilderness. Saul and his army followed us.
I wanted to prove to Saul that I wasn't his enemy. Last night, God helped me, Abishai, and I sneaked into Saul's camp. Saul was surrounded by 3,000 soldiers and his bodyguards.
Think what would have happened if you had been caught.
Yes, but God made a deep sleep fall over everyone. We walked right up to where Saul was sleeping. His spear and water jug were right by his head.
I thought it was a great chance. I picked up Saul's spear and said to David, I can kill Saul with one blow. Then he won't try to kill you anymore, and you will be king, just as God promised.
So you did try to kill Saul?
No, David wouldn't let me.
Keep reading.
David, we took Saul's spear and jug and quickly left. We went to the opposite hill, and I called out loudly that I could have killed Saul.
Did the king's guard believe you?
Not until he saw that the water jug and the spear were missing.
Then King Saul called out and asked me if it was really me. He could hardly believe it. I told Saul, the Lord delivered you into my hands, but and now, children, let's open to 1 Samuel chapter 26, verse 23. And I'll read that so you can answer that question before we continue with our play. Verse 23 in our Bible says, let me find it. The Lord rewards everyone for their righteousness and faithfulness. The Lord delivered you into my hands today, but I would not lay a hand on the Lord's anointed. Okay, let's go back to that blank. It says, the Lord delivered you into my hands, but I, and you can write in the blank on your paper, I would not lay a hand on you because God has chosen you to be king for now.
So did Saul change his mind about trying to kill you?
He said so, but Saul keeps changing his mind. I'll stay away from him for now. I could have gotten even with him, but I trust God. I'm glad I followed God's way. Thank you, Miss Nancy and Miss Renee, for joining us today. Children, I have some questions for you about this story. Let's see if you can answer them. I'll hold them up and see if you know what the answers are. Here's the first one. How had Saul hurt David? Do you think it was fair? Did you hear in the story? How did Saul hurt David? Well, Saul drove David out of the city and he forced him to hide out in the wilderness. Saul kept chasing David, trying to kill him, even though David had done nothing wrong. This wasn't fair, was it? No, it was not. Let's go on to the second question. What was David's chance to get even? Do you want me to read that part to you again? I'm going to read from your friend's book a little bit about that. When nighttime came, the king's soldiers set up a camp. They put the king's bed in the middle. A special guard slept by the king to keep him safe. King Saul lay down to rest. His spear and water jug were next to him. Soon he fell fast asleep. The guard and all the soldiers fell asleep too. Later, David came with one of his men, Abishai. They saw the king's men all around him asleep. "Let's go closer to the king," said David. The two men walked right up to Saul. "I will kill the king," said Abishai. "Then he won't hurt you anymore." "No," said David, "Saul is the king. We should not hurt the leader that God chose." David and his friend took the king's spear and water jug and went to a nearby hill. So the question again was, what was David's chance to get even? Well, God allowed them to sneak right up next to Saul because everyone had gone into a deep sleep. But they could have killed Saul right there. There was a spear right next to him, but they chose not to. So they did not get even in that way. Do you think David had a good reason for feeling like getting even with Saul? Do you think David had a good reason for wanting to get even though it doesn't say David wanted to get even? Would you have felt like getting even? I think we understand that Saul was probably trying to kill David still. He had tried to kill him back at the palace, and he still wanted him dead and was chasing him around when he had done nothing wrong. So I can understand that David could have had a good reason for getting even, but he chose not to. Do you think David might have had a good reason not to trust God? That's a tough one. But we know years ago, Samuel had told David that he would be king. God had promised this to David years ahead of time. But right now, Saul was king, and David was running for his life. So don't you think maybe he was wondering if God got this right? Maybe he said, well, God said I would be king someday, but look, I'm still running from King Saul. So maybe he was unsure if he could trust God. Why didn't David get even with Saul? Do you know why David didn't get even with Saul? Because David wanted to follow God's way. God had promised to make him king, and David was willing to wait until God's timing was right. David would not hurt God's chosen king. Okay. So what was God's way in this story? Well, God's way was for David to not get even and to trust God for God's perfect timing. And that's something we can all work on, trusting God and waiting for his perfect timing. Let's look at our memory verse for today. Hatred stirs up conflict, but love covers over all wrongs. Proverbs 10, verse 12. Let's talk about this verse a little more. Can you see it? I'll move it a little closer. Hatred stirs up conflict, but love covers over all wrongs. Proverbs 10, verse 12. Okay. Well, our memory verse says that hatred stirs up conflict. Well, what do you think conflict means? And how does it relate to our Bible story? Let's go over that question again. Our memory verse says that hatred stirs up conflict. What is conflict, and how does it relate to our Bible story? Think about that one. Well, conflict is disagreement and anger. So if David had hated King Saul, it would have made the problem a lot worse, wouldn't it? Because David showed love, Saul changed his mind about killing David. Because King Saul was very vulnerable. He had been asleep, and he realized that David and Abishai could have killed him while he was asleep. But David showed love and let him live. So that really touched King Saul when he realized that, and he changed his mind about trying to kill David. Let's go over this question. What are some ways you might be able to choose God's way instead of getting even at school? So let's say when you're with friends, and how can you choose God's way instead of getting even? Let's say somebody cuts you off in the hallway when you're in line. They jump in front of you, and you wanted to be closer to the front. Okay? So maybe you could, instead of getting angry, you might just say a kind word to them. You might forgive them for what they have done to you. Okay? Maybe you don't go and say bad things about them later, about the person who cut you off. Okay? There's all different kinds of things that can happen that make us angry, and sometimes we want to get even. But just by showing love and forgiving them, we can let that situation go. What about at home? What are some ways you might be able to choose God's way instead of getting even at home? Well, what if your brother or sister doesn't share with you? when you're playing a game or with toys and they don't share with you? Instead of getting even, how could you show God's way? Maybe just give them a turn, or maybe set up a system where you take turns with things. Showing them forgiveness for the way they acted towards you and taking it away. Think about that this week, of how you might be able to choose God's way instead of getting even. Okay. Now, there are some fun activities that you can do this week. When we were reading the play in this book, in your discovery pack, it looks like a fun maze that you can do on the front. And then on the back, there's an activity about what is God's way and comparing them to different stories. So you have that fun activity to do. And then you can read in your friend's book the story on the front. There's an alphabet activity on the back that looks kind of cool. Okay. And you can just read the story to your parents and show them the picture and tell them about how David had the opportunity to get even, but he chose to show love instead. Can you go over this verse with me? And then I'm going to cover up a few words and see if you can say it again. Hatred stirs up conflict, but love covers over all wrongs. Proverbs 10, verse 12. Let's see if I cover up a word. Let's see if you can remember what that word was when we say the verse. I think I'm going to cover up the first word. Do you remember? Something stirs up conflict, but love covers over all wrongs. What was that? Do you remember? The word was hatred. Hatred stirs up conflict, but love covers over all wrongs. Let me cover up another word and see if you can remember what's under that. Okay, now we have two blanks, two words that are covered. Blank stirs up conflict, but blank covers over all wrongs. Do you remember what words go here and here? Hatred stirs up conflict, but love covers over all wrongs. One more time, and it'll help us to memorize by saying this over and over. Okay. 3 words covered up. Can you say it with me? What's our first word going to be? Okay, let's see. Hatred stirs up conflict, but love covers over, what's this word? All wrongs. Proverbs 10:12. One more time and then we'll pray. I'll leave them covered and you say it with me. Hatred stirs up conflict, but love covers over all wrongs. Proverbs 10, verse 12. Good job. That was a tough one. These verses are hard sometimes. Okay, let's take a moment and pray about what we've learned today. And hopefully you can apply this in your life this week. When somebody makes you mad and makes you feel like getting even, hopefully you'll remember to what? To love, because love covers over all wrongs. Okay? To love instead of getting even. Take a hand, give a little clap. Take a hand, and fold them just like that. Dear God, we thank you for this lesson from your word. We know your word is always true, and we can learn from it every time we read it, Lord. Please help us in following your way this week, because we know that your way is better than getting even. Help us to forgive and help us to show love. Amen. Thank you, children, and I'll see you next week for Sunday school. Have a great week. Bye.